Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Rosie.
How are you doing tonight, Rosie?
I am doing good. How are you, you big 30-year-old?
I'm good. I didn't see that coming.
That's right, folks. Rye guy turned 30.
Yeah.
Do you feel so mature?
No. Well, I do feel old because I had like a combination of indigestion
Upset
and
stomach
allergies.
and diarrhea.
No. Allergies, indigestion, and what else did I have last night? Oh yeah, sore teeth. So
the sads
I was like,
being 30.
Man, 30 sucks.
Mm-hmm. But
Anyway.
Today, you're feeling good, right?
Yes, I'm feeling better.
30,
You've been
30
very
and thriving.
kind to me today.
Thank you.
Basically babying me because I'm 30 now.
I hope you return the favor.
I will.
When I'm 30.
If I'm still here.
Okay.
I mean alive.
Moving on.
Okay. This episode of Voice of the Victim podcast is sponsored by Podcorn. If you're listening to the show, you know that we're passionate about the things we talk about. We love to share these stories. We love to get these messages out there, but it does take a lot of time and energy to make these things.
The sponsors help us be able to work less at our other jobs and spend more time making the show the best it can be.
But, of course, we don't know what we're doing. Finding sponsors was just completely new, uncharted territory for us. It felt intimidating. But Podcorn made it possible for even us to find sponsors.
Podcorn is a simple and easy-to-use marketplace that connects podcasters directly to sponsorship opportunities. There's no middleman, so podcasters can choose what their specific rate is and collaborate directly with the brands.
I like the fact that we're able to pick the type of ad that we do. I'm not a fan of the jarring ads that completely throw off the tone of the episode by having some completely random person start talking with loud music and all that. I like host-read ads. With Podcorn, we're able to have that option.
You don't need to give up creative control or rights to your podcast to use Podcorn. And the people that work there are always willing to help and work with you to make the process painless.
They also secure funds before we even start working on the ads to make sure we're paid when we're done.
The marketplace mission of Podcorn is to give podcasters transparency, creative freedom, and full control of how and when they monetize their hard work.
And we know podcasters work hard. So if you're a podcaster of any size, click the link in our show notes to sign up to Podcorn and start browsing opportunities to find your own sponsors. Now that that's out of the way, this is going to be a rough episode. So we want to start with a huge trigger warning because we're going to discuss the cruel acts of John Wayne Gacy and the things he would inflict on his victims. Obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you already know we talk about difficult stuff, but we don't want to shock anyone with what we're saying today. So, of course, we'll be as sensitive as possible in telling this. We don't really talk about serial killers very often for this reason, because they're just so hard to discuss. So many different victims with such disgusting things being done. But these are things that all of these victims had to endure in their final moments, so we want to be the voice for them since they had their own voice violently taken away from them. And if they had to endure it, there's no reason we can't talk about it. You know?
Right.
It's a lot easier than having to live through it. So as we've discussed over the past few weeks, John Wayne Gacy used his positions of power to take advantage of teenage boys working for him. He would gain their trust, then he'd use alcohol or even sedatives, muscle relaxers, and nerve suppressors to make his victims easier to take advantage of. And it typically ended with him handcuffing them, raping them, and then taking their lives.
It's terrible. In order to trick the boys into putting on the handcuffs, after some failed attempts, He came up with a sick and twisted way to manipulate them into restraining themselves. First, he'd put the handcuffs on himself and then seemingly wiggle his way out of them. After that, he'd offer to show his target how to do the trick. But once the victim had willingly put the handcuffs on, waiting to see the trick, Gacy would look at them cruelly and say, "The trick is, you have to have the key."
So this guy had become such a cold, calculated monster. And this is such an evil thing to do because he straight up takes advantage of people because he wants to be so fully in control so he can see himself as more powerful, stronger than he really is.
Right.
And he uses cheap ways like this to assert that power.
John would then go on to sexually assault his victim, often sitting on their chest before forcing them to perform oral sex on him. He would often then physically torture them, burning them with cigars, riding them like a horse, and violating them even further beyond the initial rape by using foreign objects like dildos or even prescription bottles.
Yeah, we'll talk more about some specific cases later, but Rosie, you had asked last week what that 2x4 with the holes in it was for.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is really disturbing, just a warning, but I guess he used it to shackle his victims up by the ankles and wrists before he tortured them.
All the while, during the physical abuse, he would verbally taunt and degrade his victims.
Yeah, so it's a weird psychology, and obviously we're not psychologists, but he had this condescending hatred for his victims, seeing them as less than himself, and he was so delusional that he would label these young men as homosexual, even though he was forcing them into these acts regardless of their sexual orientation. But he would develop this hatred for them because he saw them as, gay, weak, whatever weird things he could come up with. And this is where many people theorize that it ties back to his childhood.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah, when his father would call him a patsy, basically say he would never be a real man. And now Gacy was acting out the role of his father in these situations, having this domineering, powerful position over a helpless victim. Or, it's interesting, last podcast covered this, they brought up the fact that the person who had molested him in the truck back when he was a kid was a construction worker.
Mm-hmm.
So,
or a contractor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he was also almost like using his abusers as a role model.
Right.
And then trying to live that role.
Mm-hmm. And
this is why therapy is so important. If he would have gotten real therapy to deal with these issues he had with his dad, a lot of lives may have been saved. If he learned how wrong those things were that were done to him and that they're not normal and how to move on from them. Or even if those doctors we talked about a couple weeks ago, rather than saying he was hopeless, if they would have tried treatment, it could have made a difference. It could have saved a lot of lives. But then again, I have no sympathy for John Wayne Gacy here because his father did eventually apologize and say he was proud of him. And that's something the vast majority of survivors don't get from their abusers, and yet they go on to heal and live productive lives. So, now that I got that out, his torture tactics got even worse. Do you have anything else to say, Rosie, before we get into this next part?
No, I'm ready to go into the next part.
All right.
He would force his victims to crawl to the bathroom while restrained, and if they wouldn't or couldn't, he would just drag them there. Then he would hold their head underwater until they were unconscious, reviving them and repeating the torture over and over again to prolong his disgusting, violent assault.
So at least 33 times these assaults resulted in a murder, and this was typically done with a rope tourniquet that he'd place around their neck and then progressively tighten it by turning the rope with a hammer handle. He would tell his victim, "This is the last trick." It's almost like he saw this as some kind of performance.
Other times, the victims were suffocated with a cloth gag stuffed into their throat.
I can't imagine going through any of these things. It's just so evil that he intentionally prolonged the pain
Right.
by choosing the slowest, most excruciating ways he could think of to torture them and eventually take their lives. He's just an absolute piece of garbage. But now we're going to talk about what we know of specific circumstances surrounding the individual victims. We today posted on Instagram all of the photos we could find of identified victims of John Wayne Gacy. We're not going to post him on our Instagram, but if you want to see the pictures of these different boys and men that we're about to talk about, they're over there, because it really gives a lot more weight to
Once
these
you see
stories.
their face.
Yeah. You can see how young they were, and just, you know, even if they were in their 20s, it's weird to consider them men because they're still pretty young. But anyway, the first murder that was committed by John Wayne Gacy was in the early morning hours of January 3rd, 1972. And this was after a family party for New Year's on the night of January 2nd. And the boy's name was Timothy McCoy.
16-year-old Timothy McCoy was at a Greyhound bus station waiting for the bus to Omaha, Nebraska. After the party that night, Gacy and his wife crashed at the home where the party took place. But Gacy decided to leave by himself in the middle of the night, and he drove over to the bus terminal where Timothy McCoy was waiting. Gacy lured the boy into his car, offering to take him on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and show him the New Year's ice sculpture displays. Then he offered to let the boy crash at his place for the night so he wouldn't need to wait at the terminal that night.
According to Gacy, he woke up the next morning to find Timothy McCoy standing in the doorway of his bedroom with a knife in his hand. He claimed that when he jumped out of bed defensively, the boy raised both arms as if to surrender, and when he did that, the knife accidentally cut Gacy's forearm. Now, this is when Gacy claims that he went into self-defense mode. And again, we're about to describe the final moments of Timothy's life, so this part is obviously really disturbing. And it's according to Gacy.
He said that he grabbed the knife out of the kid's hands, slammed his head against the wall, and kicked him against the wardrobe. Then, as John was walking towards him, Timothy kicked John in the stomach. But in response to this, John flew into a rage and wrestled Timothy down to the ground and stabbed him several times in the chest. When Gacy finally snapped out of his rage, he stood up, and as the boy laid on the carpet dying, John walked into his kitchen and saw an open carton of eggs and unsliced bacon on the counter.
So, what story does that tell you, Rosie?
He, like, as if he saw that and then was like, oh, yeah, breakfast? Like, what?
Well, this poor kid was trying to make breakfast for John. And this is what he did. Again, this is John's account of what happened.
So that's why he had the knife in his hand.
Yeah.
Because he was
cutting
gonna
bacon.
cut the bacon.
But when John tells the story, he makes it sound like he began acting in self-defense. But in reality, he probably just used that as a cover for what he was planning all along.
Right.
Even if John was startled when he awoke to see Timothy in the doorway with a knife, you'd think in the time it took this large man to roll out of bed and make his way to the doorway, Timothy would have noticed that John looked fearful and defensive and explained himself.
Yeah, why would they be that close to each other from him being in the doorway?
Right?
Yeah.
But one thing we can be sure of is that Timothy's final moments were absolutely horrifying, and sadly for him, this man would walk free for another 6 years before he'd be held accountable for this.
I'm not buying his story at all.
I know. But once this was all over, Gacy said that he noticed he'd experienced arousal during this murder. And I guess this is the point where murder became connected to sexual pleasure in his brain.
Yuck.
It reminds me kind of the shoemaker story, which we haven't told on here yet, but probably will at some point.
Oh, that's like one of the most disturbing stories ever.
Yeah. It's so scary that these connections can be made between two things that should be completely unrelated, between sex and murder. Just disgusting.
Gacy's second murder wasn't for another 2 years, in January of 1974. Sadly, this victim remains unidentified, but we know he was strangled and can imagine his experience was also horrific. The next year, on July 31st of 1975, the third victim of Gacy was 18-year-old John Butkovich from Lombard, another suburb in Chicago. He was the son of Yugoslavian immigrants. His car was found with the keys still in the ignition, parked near the corner of Sheridan and Lawrence. His wallet and jacket were also still in the car.
Yeah, so
Wow.
He wasn't planning on being out of his car for long, obviously, but this particular victim had known Gacy prior to this. And this is where we see Gacy's insecurities about his manhood come through. He can't handle any perceived disrespect from another man without wanting some kind of violent revenge. So the day before the murder, John Butkovich had actually confronted Gacy about some outstanding back pay that he was owed, which was 2 weeks late.
Now, after John disappeared, his father called Gacy to ask if he knew anything, and Gacy told him he was sorry his son had, quote, run away, and would be happy to help search for him.
So
Disgusting.
He's creating this false narrative with the father by saying he'd run away, putting words in his mouth. And I think that's so dumb, because if someone goes missing, no one has a clue what actually happened. So by putting a specific label on it like this, Gacy's making himself look pretty suspicious, at least to me.
That's a good point.
And we also know the father did know about, his son going to confront Gacy because he knew that his pay was 2 weeks late. So he knew there was some tension there.
Police also questioned Gacy about this because of the confrontation from the day before. But Gacy claimed John had showed up to his house with 2 friends demanding the overdue payment, but they had reached a compromise and the boys left peacefully.
And the police bought into this BS, which, as we'll see, becomes a pattern here.
How did they not ask about those 2 boys' identity
Right?
that were with him?
That's a good question. But what's really, really sad here is that John's parents, again, not John Wayne Gacy, but John Butkovich, there's a lot of Johns in this story. A lot of the victims' names are John. But John Butkovich's parents actually called the police several times, begging them to investigate Gacy further. They had a suspicion that Gacy had something to do with this, because again, they knew about the confrontation. It said that they called over 100 times.
Wow.
But it went nowhere. The police didn't take it seriously. And it just blows my mind how many times one person could be accused of something like this and still keep getting the benefit of the doubt from the police, because he'd already been in prison. He'd already been convicted of sexual assault on a minor.
Right.
And now he's been accused of it again, and they're like, oh, he probably didn't do it. They just don't do anything about it. But Rosie, what do we know now really happened to John Butkovich?
Well, according to Gacy, he was on the corner of West Lawrence Avenue when he saw John B. get out of his car, waving to get Gacy's attention. John B. walked up to Gacy's car, saying he wanted to talk. Gacy acted courteous and invited the kid into his car and over to his house to pay him.
John B. agreed to go over to the house, thinking that his boss was being honest and would just run him back to the house quick and pay him. Although it's strange that he didn't go grab any of his stuff out of his car, at least grab his keys out of the ignition before riding to Gacy's house.
Yeah.
Which, like you're probably thinking right now, means that
There was some force involved.
Again, this retelling is according to Gacy. It could have been much more forceful or threatening than what he's saying.
Well, once they were at Gacy's house, he offered John a drink. He used his manipulative trick to get John cuffed behind his back, and he threw him down on the back and sat on his chest for a while before going on to strangle him.
Can you imagine how bad that would hurt? Having your hands cuffed behind your back and being forced, having someone lay on top of you?
Yeah, I almost read that wrong because my instinct would be you throw them on their stomach, not on their back.
Yeah.
If they're cuffed behind their back.
But again, Gacy wants to inflict as much pain as possible. it seems like, which this would be excruciating. You have your entire body weight plus John Wayne Gacy, who's a big fat dude, all on top of your hands while they're cuffed.
Yeah, you're right. That would be terrible.
But John Bukovich was the one victim who was buried under the garage because at that time, Gacy was still married and his wife and daughters had come home earlier than expected the day this happened. So he panicked. He already had a gap in the concrete where he intended to dig a drain at some point. So he just used that. And we didn't mention this last week, but this garage, where his wife had found that gay porn stash, she wasn't allowed in there. She had actually snuck his key and snuck in the garage to find that stuff.
Not allowed in there?
Yeah, which as last podcast pointed out, if your spouse ever has a room that you're not allowed in,
you go in
probably a serial killer. The fact that she wasn't allowed in there and that he got away with this for so long makes me wonder what kind of emotional abuse that she had put up with just living with him,
Oh, I'm sure there was enough to mess her up a little bit.
Yeah. It's sad because that in itself could probably be a compelling story. But there's so many other things that Gacy did that it's completely overshadowed if anything was going on. But this was 1975. It's the year he went full-time in his own business. It's also the time he began frequently searching out victims and becoming a clown. All these weird life changes were happening this year. And I guess he was getting very comfortable with, taking victims because he wasn't being held accountable for anything.
Now, most of these murders were committed between 1976 and 1978, partially because this was after his divorce, when he lived alone and had nobody to hide his horrible secrets from. But even so, several of his neighbors were starting to notice Gacy's erratic behavior after the divorce, like hearing his car come and go at really early morning hours, or his lights turn on around the same time, and also seeing him hanging out with these teenage boys. In retrospect, another neighbor said that she and her son had been awakened in the middle of the night by what sounded like muffled screaming, shouting, and crying, coming from the direction of Gacy's house. Gacy's fourth murder victim was an 18-year-old man named Daryl Sampson. Just 1 month after the divorce was finalized, Daryl was last seen on April 6, 1976, until he was identified as one of the victims buried under Gacy's house. He was suffocated to death by a cloth in his throat.
Now, Gacy's cool-down period was getting much shorter around this time. His next victim was just a month later, on May 14th. A 15-year-old boy named Randall Reffitt had disappeared while walking home from school. And then just a couple hours later, another 14-year-old boy named Samuel Stapleton went missing while walking home from his sister's apartment. And this was Gacy's first known double murder.
Just a couple hours later? I can't...
Yeah. I wonder if he did this, if he killed them both at the same time, because they were buried right next to each other under the house.
Less than a month later, on June 3rd, Gacy abducted 17-year-old Michael Bonin from Lakeview while he was traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. Then just another 10 days later, he murdered a 16-year-old boy from Uptown named William Carroll.
There isn't much information for many of these victims because there are so many of them. And like we mentioned before, some of them were drifters who weren't really close enough to many people to be missed. Speaking of which, between June 13th and August 6th, one adult man, as well as 3 more unidentified boys between 16 and 17, were murdered by Gacy.
On August 5th, 16-year-old James Hackinson from our home state of Minnesota went missing. The last time his family spoke with him was that day, when James called them possibly from Gacy's home. Later, he was also murdered by Gacy.
No, James, or as his family knew him, Jimmy Hackinson, his family had been missing him for 40 years.
Wow.
Not knowing what really happened, because he wasn't identified as one of the victims until 2017. Hackinson's mother had suspected her son may have been a victim of Gacy, and she asked police to look into it. But the only way to make an ID back then was dental records, and Jimmy didn't have any on file, so they had to wait until DNA testing was a thing. And then they had to match the DNA with Jimmy's brother and sister to identify him. And for each of these victims, whether they were ID'd or not, there was a family who was missing them, just like Jimmy's family here, having no idea where they went. And I'm sure a lot of families went through this similar period of frustration. I can't imagine having no idea what happened to my loved one for 40 years.
Yeah, I can't either.
Just the inner turmoil
That you'd always have with you.
Yeah.
The very next day after Jimmy was murdered, on August 6th, 1976, that was the last day 17-year-old Rick Johnston from Bensonville was seen alive. And Rick and Jimmy were buried next to each other under Gacy's house.
Yeah. So, with these double murders here, it kind of explains why Gacy had so many sedatives and nervous system inhibitors at his house, because he probably needed those to be able to subdue 2 boys at a time. It's absolutely sickening how many lives he was able to take in such a short time. He was obviously getting really addicted to it and disturbingly comfortable with it. But speaking of that, this next string happened in extremely fast succession.
2 more of the unidentified victims were assumed to have been murdered between August and October of 1976. Then, on October 24th, Gacy committed another double murder. This time, it was teenage friends named Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino, who were last seen standing outside of a restaurant on Clark Street in Chicago. Then, just 2 days later, a 19-year-old construction worker named William Bundy told his family he was going to a party, but was never seen again. He had done work for Gacy in the past, and William was also one of his victims. As far as we know, Gacy didn't take any lives in November of 1976. But in December, he was back at it. A 17-year-old kid named Gregory Godzik had worked for Gacy for just 3 weeks before going missing. He was on a date with his girlfriend just before he went missing, and he was last seen by her at her house when he dropped her off.
Now, later it came out that Gregory Godzik had been venting to his family about some strange work Gacy had asked him to do. He was asked to dig trenches for drain tiles down in Gacy's crawl space.
Oh my gosh, he was digging his own grave.
Yeah, when you put it like that, oh my God.
His parents and older sister, Eugenia, also called Gacy, asking if he knew anything about the disappearance. Again, Gacy told the family that Gregory had talked about wanting to run away in the past, and that he'd probably followed through on that.
Yeah, he actually even claimed that Gregory had left a message on his answering machine shortly after the disappearance. And again, I don't know why he would claim this. It seems so stupid, because obviously they would want to hear this message. But when they asked, he told them he'd already erased it. So it's like, why even put yourself in that position where you have to say, oh, well, actually, I deleted it already?
Because it's like dangling a carrot. I'm sure he loved the thrill of them having a sliver of hope for a couple minutes.
True. I bet he added a lot of these details to the stories, like with the bacon and stuff like this, to make his stories more believable, because he did, in certain circumstances, try to paint his victims in a sympathetic light. All right, now this next victim's name is also John, but his last name, I think it's Polish, and we're not 100% positive on this pronunciation, because it's spelled S-Z. Yes, S-Z-Y-C. And every single site we could find said that it was pronounced shits.
The next month, on January 20th, 1977, Gacy lured another 19-year-old man named John Schitz to his house after expressing interest in buying a Plymouth Satellite from him. But once he had John in his house, he made his move and took his life as well. And after that, he went on to sell his car to Michael Rossi for $300.
John wasn't selling his car here. He was selling John Schitz's car.
Oh.
Gacy killed him, took his car, and sold it.
How? How would he get away with it? I don't understand how none of this...
This car will come back into play later.
Okay. During that time, between December of 76 and March of 1977, another unidentified victim was killed. This one was buried underneath another man who was confirmed to be murdered on March 15th of 1977. His name was John Prestige, who was 20 years old at the time when he was slain by Gacy. According to people who knew John Prestige, he'd recently talked about finding work with a new contractor, who we now know was John Wayne Gacy.
Then we have yet another unidentified youth victim who was buried in the crawl space somewhere between March and July of 1977, because he was buried between John Prestige and this next victim we're going to talk about. And there's just so many, and these are just the ones we know of. You know, remember, at some point, Gacy ran out of space on his property and started dumping victims in the river, and who knows how many there may have been out in the river that he never mentioned. Like, if they were never found, memories can be spotty, especially when you are doing such horrible things. And for a long time, Gacy even claimed that he had never even heard of any of the people he killed. So his words are very unreliable.
Yeah. On July 5th, another confirmed victim was 19-year-old Matthew Bowman from Crystal Lake. He was last seen by his mother at a train station. In August, Michael Rossi had driven off from a gas station without paying for his gas.
Now again, Michael Rossi is the one who had lived with Gacy for a while, and then Gacy sold that stolen car to him.
Right. The station attendant had reported the license number to the local police, who realized it was the car of John Schitz, who had been missing since January. The car was traced to Gacy's home, who told them that John had sold him the car in February and told him that he needed the money to get out of town. How convenient.
Why would you sell your car when you want to leave town, though?
That doesn't make any sense, unless you're flying, across the country.
Flying or taking the bus, but in most cases, your car is a pretty important part of leaving town. It's weird. But the police informed Schitz's mother of the situation, and once again, they did not pursue it any further. I cannot understand how this guy can have a close connection to so many different disappearances, and yet they buy every word he said.
Right.
He's literally being questioned about a disappearance every couple of months.
Yeah, I don't understand that either. How can there be so many coincidences where they're just...
They just okay, whatever.
Yeah. On September 15th, 1977, an 18-year-old named Robert Gilroy, who was actually the son of a police sergeant, went missing. He lived just 4 blocks away from Gacy. How gutsy.
Well, listen to this, though. This one's actually a really strange circumstance, because he was later found buried in the crawl space. But Gacy was confirmed with a solid alibi to be out of town in Pittsburgh from September 12th to the 16th. So this introduces the idea that Gacy had accomplices, which is pretty, a lot of people believe that. Because we know he kept close company with many young men, and we know the power he had over them, especially the ones who had lived with him. If he would have asked them for assistance, whether it was spreading quicklime or digging trenches, those are things that were aiding in these crimes. So they probably felt like if they did let the secret out, either they'd be next or they'd go down with Gacy for the crimes. But apparently it seems like one of them got corrupted and committed a murder himself. So it just makes me wonder what kind of things Gacy was doing to the ones he kept alive.
Right.
That he had this close relationship with and who worked for him at PDM. It's just this sick, twisted manipulation through imposed power over these kids.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I guess I personally didn't know about the accomplice thing.
Yeah, that was I mean, it's a pretty widespread speculation.
Interesting. On September 25th, 1977, a 19-year-old U.S. Marine named John Mowry went missing. He'd just finished 18 months in the service and had stopped by his mom's house to say he was going out for the night. After leaving his mom's house, he was never seen again. Later, he was also found in the crawl space. On October 17th, another Minnesotan named Russell Nelson disappeared after last being seen outside a bar in Chicago. The 21-year-old was looking for contracting work, and again, this was how he got in contact with Gacy. A few weeks later, 16-year-old Robert Winch from Kalamazoo became one of Gacy's victims. Then soon after that, on November 18th, a 20-year-old named Tommy Bolling was murdered. Wow, that's so many in a month, like a few weeks.
I know, it's... Like, I feel bad like we're glossing over them because there's so many, but again, there's not enough information to really talk about each victim in depth. But Tommy Bolling actually had a 3-year-old son named Timmy. So now we have a child here who has a huge impact on his life because of John Wayne Gacy's crimes.
Another 19-year-old, David Talsma, who served as a U.S. Marine, told his mother he was going to a rock concert in Hammond on December 9th. But again, he was killed by Gacy.
Yeah.
How is Gacy taking out U.S. Marines? That seems...
Well, he has his
strange
handcuff trick, and he has narcotic sedatives. He has all this crazy crap that he uses to assert dominance because he wants to feel powerful. Ugh. Now, this next one gives us a unique insight from the victim's perspective into exactly what Gacy puts these boys through, because this one in particular was able to get away.
On December 30th, 1977, Gacy abducted 19-year-old Robert Donnelly at gunpoint from a bus stop in Chicago.
He always seems to be doing something around New Year's.
Yeah, you're right. He drove him to his home, where he went on to rape and torture the boy, repeatedly dunking his head underwater in the bathtub until he lost consciousness. Robert remembers Gacy saying creepy things like, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Donnelly became so dejected after this torture that he actually asked Gacy to just kill him and get it over with.
Again, this is more detail than we have on most of these crimes, but you can assume that a lot of them had to experience these same things. Now, Gacy, being the sick, maniacal monster that he is, wanted to prolong the torture for as long as possible, so he told Robert that he'd get around to it. But in a very strange turn of events, which almost seems like Gacy just not wanting to give this person what he wanted, drove him to his workplace and let him go free, saying that if he reported it, the police wouldn't believe him. Which, up to this point, I mean...
They hadn't.
Yeah, exactly. But thank goodness he didn't take Robert's life here, but it almost feels like he just wanted to not do what Robert was asking for in this place, because he asked him to just kill him and get it over with. But at the same time, maybe he was just feeling lazy, and because you'd think it's a lot of work to follow through on these murders. But either way shows that he had become so cavalier at this point that he just felt fine letting this rape victim go after all this torture, and he felt untouchable apparently because none of these accusations.
He must have felt, that's what I would assume, is that he felt so untouchable that he didn't feel like it would be a problem if he did get reported.
And because he was such a suck-up and a seemingly charismatic person, I wonder if he had connections in the police departments, like buddies, where he was like, oh, they're just full of crap. They just hate me because I'm fat, or they hate me because I'm successful or something. Yeah.
Well, thankfully, Robert Donnelly did report the assault. And once again, Gacy was questioned by police on January 6th of 1978. Gacy told them that he and Robert had a consensual slave sex relationship, adding that he didn't pay the kid so it wouldn't be labeled as prostitution.
If it was consensual, why would Robert report it? Mm-hmm. So again, the police believed Gacy. How many times can you be accused of the same thing without being held accountable? But thanks to this absolute crap police work, Gacy was able to go on to take even more lives after this.
How could these... How are these people police officers? Like, how could this happen? I don't understand. I'm almost wondering, like, was he paying the cops off, or were the cops...
I do wonder that.
The accomplice... You know what I mean? Like,
I also wonder if this was... I mean, most of these things happen in Chicago. So it's like, you'd think at least the precincts within Chicago would communicate with each other.
They must just be dirty cops. Like, I can't fathom how they would not think, oh, another red flag. I guess we'll just throw it away. Like, how would they just stop not?
Yeah, that's one of the most baffling parts of this case, is how many times the police ignored accusations against Gacy.
On February 16th, 1978, 19-year-old William Kindred told his fiancée that he was going to go hang out at the bar. But his fiancée never saw him again. Kindred was the final victim who fit in the crawl space of Gacy's home. The next month, on March 21st, 1978, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall into his car, chloroformed him, and drove him back to his house. Once they got there, Gacy restrained his arms and head in a homemade pillory device that was attached to the ceiling.
Now, again, we talked about Jeffrey Rignall, I think 1 or 2 weeks ago. He was another one that Gacy let go. But a pillory is like one of those traps that you see in like old Renaissance-y style stuff, you know, where there's a hole for each wrist and then for the head. Like
stocks? Isn't that what?
Yeah.
Jeffrey's feet were also restrained, locked into another device. He told Jeffrey that he had complete control over him and intended to do whatever he wanted, when he wanted, and how he wanted. He raped and tortured Jeffrey with many things from lit candles to whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him, making him pass out.
Again, just showing Gacy's motivation here was to have power and control over his victims, based on what he said to Jeffrey here. And Jeffrey, like we said, we mentioned him last week, but when he was found, you know, he was severely injured. He had anal bleeding, and he was just so beat up. And yet Gacy's feeling brazen enough to leave his victims alive in such terrible condition, as if that won't come back to bite him.
Why would it at the point?
Yeah, exactly. Why wouldn't he feel confident?
Yeah.
With the way he just keeps getting away with stuff.
Well, Jeffrey was in a lot of pain, but he managed to stagger himself over to his girlfriend's apartment. They called the police and reported the assault. But like usual, the police did not investigate Gacy.
Yeah, so we mentioned before that Gacy did get arrested for this crime, but it wasn't because of the work of the police. Jeffrey Rignall himself, the victim who was horribly hurt by this crime, is the one who actually conducted an investigation for himself, along with a couple buddies.
Jeffrey was able to recall Gacy's Oldsmobile and roughly where he'd been driving. So Jeffrey and his friends did a stakeout in the area and eventually spotted the Oldsmobile, which they followed back to Gacy's house. Finally, after this, police obtained an arrest warrant, and on July 15th, he was arrested for this battery charge.
But even then, this arrest on July 15th was 4 months after the crime and 3 months after Jeffrey identified him as the attacker, because they did this stakeout in April. So the gears of justice slowly turning. But this battery charge was the open charge that was on Gacy when he was finally looked into as a suspect for Robert Peist's disappearance. But even during this time, he was able to keep committing murders.
Oh my gosh, it's insane. On June 30th, 1978, Gacy picked up Timothy O'Rourke, who he likely began stalking after seeing him at a gay bar. But when Timothy left his apartment to buy cigarettes, Gacy abducted him, abused him, and then took his life and dumped him in a river.
Timothy's body was actually found the same day it went missing, near the Dresden Island Lock and Dam in the Illinois River.
And yet they couldn't get any type of DNA or evidence?
I don't know.
Like, how?
Well, they didn't have DNA back then.
Oh, that's right.
Like, a DNA analysis, at least. Yeah.
19-year-old Frank Lanigan disappeared on November 4th, 1978. He was later found in the Des Plaines River on November 12th with a pair of bikini briefs lodged in his throat. It's disgusting. 20-year-old James Mazzara from Elmwood went missing on November 23rd after having Thanksgiving dinner with his family and then walking with a suitcase toward Bughouse Square, or Washington Square Park. Just before his disappearance, he told his sister that he was working in construction and, quote, doing all right. He was found in the Des Plaines River on December 28th, 1978.
Now, the final victim, who we discussed last week, was Robert Peist. After Robert left his mother waiting at that pharmacy, Gacy abducted Robert and took him home.
Gacy asked Robert if there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price. Robert responded that he didn't mind hard work.
So, this poor kid was so innocent. He had no idea what he was dealing with here. And again, he was only 15 at the time, relatively on the young end of Gacy's victims.
Soon after this, Robert fell victim to Gacy's handcuff trick. Once he was subdued, Gacy told him, "I'm going to rape you, and you can't do anything about it." Robert broke into tears after this in shock over the way this had all turned out.
And I'm sure it was like this for most of the victims. Just complete shock at what was happening. But Robert was on the younger side, like we said. He probably had never even thought about murder. I can't imagine how blindsided he must have been. And as he wept at the realization of what was going on, Gacy put a rope around his neck and choked him to death. As if this wasn't cold and callous enough, while Robert was laying on the floor dying, Gacy took a business call.
Oh, that makes me want to cry. That's disgusting.
So, that's it for the murders. We're finally done with John Wayne Gacy. This is obviously a really tough one to get through, but, if we had a hard time with it, I can't imagine what these victims felt. Gacy went from an abused child who I initially felt a little pity for to an absolute abomination of a person. It feels wrong to even call him a human being at this point because he became literal garbage. Many of you know that on the show we usually try to see things from as many perspectives as possible while trying to be a voice for the victim. But even with what Gacy went through as a child, I have absolutely no pity or respect left for this dumpster man.
Gacy was executed on May 9th, 1994. As one of the prosecutors from his trial put it, he got a much easier, more merciful death than any one of his victims did. He never expressed any responsibility or remorse. And just like Ted Bundy, just prior to his execution, he stated that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others.
Yeah, again, trying one last time to weasel his way out of execution. I don't care, and I won't share his final words because they don't matter. In covering this, we don't want to give him a platform, but we wanted to be able to convey how he became what he became and the horrible experiences his victims suffered. because we originally decided to do this case because of that Peacock special. Do you remember what it was called? Something about a clown.
I don't remember what it was called, but he was a clown in like the picture for it.
Anyway, when we started watching that, it just felt weird to us because it was giving Gacy, it was basically playing through and dissecting footage from one of Gacy's final interviews. And it just felt weird to be giving this man a platform. And at the time we watched it, I didn't really know much about what he did. But
it gave you a very casual, like he was just like a casual guy.
Just like he was with the murders. But now, after learning everything he did, I can't even imagine giving him the time of day to listen to him talk. I don't know. It just feels weird to me, and that's just my opinion. But I know a lot of people do want to try to understand the mind of a serial killer, so everyone has their own thing. I just can't bring myself to finish that documentary. Anyway, I'm glad we're done with this.
Me too.
I did not know it would be 4 parts when we started. All right. Well, Rosie, did you know that people can leave reviews for our podcast on Facebook?
No.
Yeah, me neither. Until today.
Oh.
I was on our main Facebook page, not our Facebook group, but the page. And it said we had 5 ratings.
Oh, really?
And we still have 5 stars over there, by the way.
So they're 5-star ratings?
Yeah.
Sweet.
They're really nice. So I'm going to start reading from there, too.
Yeah, for sure.
And the one we're going to read this week is from Kathleen Bullock from March.
Oh,
so
cool.
Do you want to read it?
Sure. It says, "This podcast grows on you. Ryan and Rosie are not your typical podcasters. They are podcasters with a heart and genuine empathy for the victims, the subjects of their podcast. I have listened for a year or so and feel like these 2 podcasters are good friends. Keep them coming. I really appreciate you."
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, that was really sweet.
If you have been wanting to leave a review and you don't have Apple,
yeah, then there you go.
Yeah, go do it on our Facebook page. Well, Rosie, what do you think?
Icky. I feel icky.
Oh,
just the 15-year-old was like that was just really sad.
I know. And we also want to apologize. Last week, we did mispronounce Robert Peist's
I was just going to say,
name.
I thought we were saying Peist.
Yeah, well, we looked it up, and it said Peist in the pronunciation, but then I heard other sources say Peist.
It happens.
And there's so many people in the story. I hope we got all the pronunciations correct, but we do our best.
Oh, I just feel like I need to watch a Disney movie now.
Well, we probably will.
Flesh out the ickies.
Probably a good recommendation for everyone after listening to this.
And snuggle a cat. Good thing we have 3 in stock.
Yeah, who were really trying to get in the office while we were recording.
Yeah.
We didn't have the cats in here while recording this because we're actually recording this way ahead of time and we're in a rush to get all our episodes recorded. So, yeah, we didn't want any distractions today.
Yeah.
So, which Disney movie do you want to watch?
I don't know. Maybe Moana. We keep saying we're going to rewatch it and then we never do.
Sounds fun. I like watching that in the winter because it's all tropical.
I don't know. I'll have to look through my saved.
We could do a Marvel movie.
Oh, no, I can't.
Who turned 30 today?
You did.
Anyway, we still just need to figure out what we're having for dinner before we worry about all this stuff.
So true.
So, thank you for listening. We really appreciate you. It's so cool that people appreciate what we do because when we started this podcast, we had no idea what we were doing, had no idea where it would go. But thanks to the amazing support of other podcasters helping support just other podcasters in general, and you amazing people who gave us a chance, it's actually become something pretty cool. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, thank you.
If you're not yet subscribed on whatever platform you're on, don't forget to do that. We're on Instagram at VOV Podcast. Now you can email us with any listener stories over at vovlistenerstories@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you. Bye.